when I was 19 years old. I left Lakeland around Memorial Day weekend and went surfing in Cocoa Beach. And after I finished surfing, I came home and saw a message on the answering machine. So I went over and I pressed the button, and I don't remember whether it was my mother or my father, but the message said, "Mark, when you get home from the beach, you need to get to your grandma's house as soon as possible." In that moment, with that one sentence, I was flooded with anxiety. I was convinced that something had gone terribly wrong and assumed that it was my grandmother, since she had been struggling with Alzheimer's disease for quite some time. And so I made my way quickly to my grandparents' house. They used to live over by the old boys club by Searstown. They had fenced in their lawn and got a dog to help protect the property, and so we got into the habit of parking at the boys club and walking across the street to the front to enter through the front door. And I remember as I crossed the street that before I could make it to the screen door on the front porch, somebody, again I don't remember who, walked up to me, and I heard them say, "Your grandmother has died." Now, you've probably gathered through hearing me preach for several years now that I was very, very close with my paternal grandparents. Had an incredibly powerful relationship with them. And so I began to just sob. I just broke down. And I went into the house. I came up the front steps and through the screened-in door, through the front porch, and as I came in through the front door of the house, I saw my grandmother sitting in a chair, crying. And I was completely confused. And I thought to myself, what are you doing here? And it dawned on me in an instant. Grandpa died. He had had a heart attack earlier that day when I was surfing. There were no cell phones back then, and so I couldn't get word until I got back from the beach. And I can tell you that it was one of the most devastating things that has ever happened to me my whole life. To this day, 23 years later, I almost cry every time I talk about it because I was so close to my grandfather. And in that moment, I knew that nothing would be the same again. We spent time together weekly, and I knew that nothing would ever be the same again as I entered into the land in between. The land in between is when life is no longer what it used to be, but your future is uncertain. And some people get thrown into the in-between land without any warning. Suddenly, they find themselves ripped out of everything that is normal and placed into a new and uncertain world. With one sentence, everything can change. Your position has been eliminated. I don't love you anymore. Mom, I'm pregnant. Dad, I'm at the police station. The tumor is malignant. Guys, we're going to have to move. In a matter of seconds, everything that is familiar is taken away from us, and the world becomes uncertain. Others gradually drift into the land in between. They see it coming a mile away, but there's nothing that they can do to stop it. And so a marriage slowly erodes year after year after year until the couple feels either like roommates or arch enemies. The heart of a teenager drifts from God as the parents watch him or her become prodigal. The business slowly bleeds out and there's no more money left, and so you have to close down shop. A parent's memory slowly fades away after an Alzheimer's diagnosis, or you watch your own health deteriorate after the doctor tells you that you have cancer. All of us have either been in the land in between, or we are currently navigating this transitional space, or before too long, we will find ourselves there. And the series that we're starting this morning is designed to give you tools to navigate this transitional space in faithful ways. The land in between is a very challenging place, and if we're not careful, we can slip into self-destructive behaviors that will cause us to lose our way and perhaps even lose ourselves. But if we stay close to God and we stay grounded in His Word, the promise is that God will guide us in ways that will strengthen our faith and lead to a brighter tomorrow. If we stay close to God, we can claim the promise that the days in front of us are going to be better than the days behind us. And so while I hope through this series to give you tools to faithfully navigate the pastoral transition that will be happening in this church over the summer, I want you to know that all of the tools that we gather throughout the next several weeks are going to be helpful in any transition that you find yourself in. And so these are tools that you can carry with you throughout your life because we're constantly entering into the land in between and figuring out how to get through without losing ourselves. And the guiding story for this series is going to be that of the Exodus. If you remember the story, after generations of slavery, God calls Moses. He hears the cries of his people. The text says that God has compassion on them. He hears the cries. God's heart breaks for these people. And he calls Moses to go and set them free, to lead them from slavery in Egypt into a new future, into a land flowing with milk and honey. And Moses reluctantly, if you remember the story, accepts the call with a little help. And he goes, and after God works some wondrous deeds through the plagues, gets those people and gets them out of slavery from Egypt. But you know that before they get to the promised land, they have to spend a really long time in the desert. The desert is a barren place with harsh conditions that create innumerable discomforts. And even though Egypt was a place of slavery and because of that misery, it was a very fertile and prosperous city where they still had all of their basic needs met. The same would be true of the land to which they were traveling. But the desert was a barren place with harsh conditions, and without God's help, these people probably wouldn't have lasted very long. They probably would not have survived the conditions. But despite the fact that the conditions of the desert were harsh, God always provided for His people. Can someone say amen? We see that God led them through the Red Sea when all of Pharaoh's army was hot on their tail. God miraculously provided water in a barren desert and daily food. God led them with a cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. And let us not forget that God not only provided for His people as they wandered in the desert, but also that Israel got two of God's greatest gifts in the desert. Two of God's greatest gifts, the most important gifts for Israel. Do you remember what they were? God gave them the Ten Commandments in the desert, which was the core of their covenant relationship with God. And God also gave them the tabernacle, which was their first place of worship. It's important to note that God did not wait until they got to the promised land to give them these great gifts, because they had to be a new people before they received the gift of a new home. That's critical. They had to become a different people before they were ready to receive the gift of a new home. God established covenant relationship with them in the desert and gave them a place of worship so that they could be transformed into a new people. And while the desert was never intended to be their final destination in God's divine plan, it was intended to be a necessary middle space where this transformation could happen. If you remember, they entered into the desert after being shaped by Egyptian culture for many, many years, for generations, including Egyptian idolatry. And they could not come into the promised land until they were weaned off of their idols and reformed in covenant relationship with the God of Abraham. They had to let go of the god Baal so that they could learn to trust Yahweh. They entered the desert with no identity as a people, and they entered with a slave mentality. But they could not enter the promised land until they were shaped into a united community of trust by the character and presence of the God of their ancestors. Their minds had to be renewed so that they no longer saw themselves as slaves, but as God's free and chosen people, called to be a light unto the nations. The Israelites desperately needed the spiritual transformation that would take place in the desert so that they could get ready to receive all of God's blessings. But you know what they say? It's a lot easier to get the people out of Egypt than it is to get the Egypt out of the people. One poignant example of the spiritual transformation that needed to take place and the challenges that this presented can be seen in their constant complaining about the food that God provided for them in the desert. According to Numbers 11, manna, the strange substance called manna, was like coriander seed. And the people would get up early in the morning and they would gather this strange substance from the dew of the ground, and then they would crush it up with a mortar and pestle, and then they would boil it until it took on a mushy consistency. Some people would eat the manna in that form, and others would pat it together and roast it over a fire to make cakes. Either way, it's what the Israelites had for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Now, after eating the same thing 2,190 times over the course of 2 years, there was a rising tide of complaint, as you can imagine. It says in Numbers 11, 4-6, it'll be projected on the screen. The rabble with them began to crave other food. They were craving something different, something new. And again, the Israelites started wailing and said, if only we had meat to eat. We remember the fish that we ate in Egypt at no cost. Also, the cucumbers, melons, leeks and onions and garlic. But now we've lost our appetite. We never see anything but this stinking manna. Can you imagine? Their attitude toward God's provision, which is to say their attitude toward God, turned pretty ugly and ungrateful. But do you blame them? I mean, do you really blame them? Instead of judging them harshly, just imagine how you would feel if you had to wander in a desert for 40 years eating the same thing at every single meal. I can't really empathize with Israel, but in a very small way, I can kind of sympathize with them. Because after Em and I came out of our honeymoon, the day that we arrived back from our honeymoon, I decided that I didn't want to be fat anymore. I'm glad you didn't laugh. And I decided I didn't want to be fat anymore, so I went to Books A Million and I got the South Beach Diet book. Now, if you know anything about South Beach Diet, Phase 1 is a very, very restricted plan. It's almost no carbs, with the exception of a few that are contained in a short list of vegetables. And I thought to myself, this can't be too bad because I love cheese and eggs and meat. And I was fine on day 1. On day 2, I started craving something other than eggs and cheese and meat. And by day 3, I would have killed for a piece of fruit and a plate of rice. Now, I only had to do phase 1 of South Beach for 2 weeks. And if I had to do phase 1 of that diet for several months or years, guess what? I think I'd be complaining too. If I got sick of eggs, cheese, and meat over the course of 2 weeks, I can't imagine how sick and tired the Israelites were of manna after 2 years. But you know, if we're smart about this, and we look for the deeper meaning, what we will see is that this really wasn't about food. If you look around in life, what's really going on is usually not what you first see with your eyes. Have you realized that? There's always usually something else if you read between the lines or go below the surface. And what we see in this story is that they're not really complaining just about the food. The real problem is that they were bitter and weary from having to spend so much time in the land in between. This was the real problem. The complaining about the food was just a symptom of the real problem that being in the desert, their joy was robbed from them. Their energy was sapped out of them. It was wearing them out. Have you ever felt that way? Just worn out by the same old, same old. And you could hear the murmuring from tent to tent. I am so sick of this. I just want to go back to Egypt. Can you identify? As you journey through the land in between, what's wearing you out? What's sapping your energy? What's robbing you of joy? I hear people say sometimes, I am sick and tired of filling out applications and sending out resumes and never getting an interview. I'm sick of being single. Now, I've waited for a long time. Will God just please go ahead and bring my soulmate into my life? Some people say, I'm sick and tired of being married. I'm not one of those people. I love being married. But some people say, I'm sick and tired of this marriage. I'm sick and tired of struggling to pay the bills. I'm sick of dealing with the kids all by myself as my husband goes and plays golf or works. I'm sick of all of these medical treatments and tests. I'm sick of being unhappy. I'm sick of going to visit my mother in the nursing home who doesn't even know who I am anymore. Can you hear yourself saying this? I'm so sick of this manna. Now, you might be thinking, well, complaining is not a capital crime. I mean, what's the big deal? You and I, if we read the story, we get a glimpse of the situation that Israel is dealing with, and we understand why they're complaining. And we think, well, what's the big deal? But, you know, God takes this complaining very seriously. Just as one example, we see that as the people chronically complain, God sends fire from heaven to burn the ground around their campsite as a way of showing that God is unhappy. It's a way of communicating judgment. You might be thinking, this seems crazy. I mean, isn't God loving and compassionate? Doesn't God understand that these people have reached a breaking point like we all do? And I think that in order to understand what's going on here, we have to distinguish between the kind of complaining that the Israelites were doing and what we might consider to be the healthy expression of our feelings to process them and move on. Next Sunday, we're going to look at the story of Moses, and we're going to see how he came to his wit's end with these people in the desert. And he got so tired of the complaining that he said to God, just kill me now. Have you ever thought that? God, just kill me now. I can't take it anymore. It became so overwhelming for him. The people were sick of the manna, and Moses was sick of the people. He didn't even want to take the call, right? God called me and said, I don't want to go, Lord. I'm not really qualified. I'm not going to do a good job. And God said, go anyway. And he finally relented, and now he's got this job that he doesn't want, and the people are driving him up a wall to the point where he wants to die. And we're going to see next week that the way that Moses expresses his anger and frustration to God was very different from the way that the Israelites were complaining in the desert. And the biggest difference is this. The way that the Israelites were complaining amounted to a rejection of God. They weren't just griping about the food. They were complaining against the God who had provided the food. They were essentially saying, God, we were better off in Egypt. We were better off as slaves. God, we were better off without you. Instead of resisting, they totally capitulated to a spirit of despair. They stopped believing that God was good. They stopped believing that God was going to take them to a better place in life. They focused on their pain and discomfort in the transitional period. They focused so much on their pain and discomfort that it created a pair of blinders that narrowed their vision and led them to see themselves as victims. Nothing is ever going to change. You ever felt that way? As hard as I try, as much as I have gone through junk and tried to fix this, nothing is ever going to change. Again, they portrayed themselves as victims, and they wallowed in negativity as their complaining became chronic. They had no trust in God, no vision of the future, and without these things, they had no patient endurance. When we find ourselves in the land in between, we have to make a decision about the kind of person we're going to become in the process. We have to remember that it's not simply the hardship that will form us, but our response to the hardship will form us too. With every discomfort that we experience, our response will both reveal the person that we are and will also set the trajectory of the person that we're going to become. Whether we grow in faith and become more compassionate and flexible, or whether we become bitter, resentful, judgmental, and rigid, has a lot to do with how we respond to disappointment and frustration. It's important to note that what angered God the most was not an occasional complaint from the people in the wilderness. Lord knows we all go through challenging times in our life and kind of spontaneously say, man, I'm sick of this, and we complain a little bit. That's not what made God angry. The real problem is that complaining had become the hallmark of their relationship with God. Their chronic complaining, once again, set a pair of blinders on their eyes that so narrowed their vision that they could not see past their immediate pain. And in this way, my friends, they forfeited a wonderful opportunity to become a people ready to receive the fullness of God's blessing. Complaining and revolt against God became an ingrained habit of the heart. Like the Israelites, if we are not careful in the land in between, complaining can also become an ingrained habit of the heart for us, causing us too to forfeit opportunities to become a people of strong faith that are ready to receive the fullness of God's blessings. So I just want you to consider a few questions this morning. How do you respond in harsh and disappointing circumstances? Do you become negative, short-sighted, and paralyzed with fear? Or do you trust God, focus on the big picture, choose joy and respond in faith? Do you allow yourselves to be disciplined and transformed by the hardships in the desert? Or do we believe that we are simply being punished for something that we did in the past in a way that has no lasting impact on our lives? Are we learning to let go of our idols, to trust God more in the desert? How do we navigate between the spaces of the way things used to be and the uncertain future without becoming a chronic complainer that misses what God is really up to in your situation? How many blessings have you missed because you're complaining and focusing on what you lack? The answer to these questions has a lot to do with memory and trust. And I want to close this morning by telling you that Israel had an invaluable resource in the desert, an invaluable tool at their hands that they completely missed. And that was the story of Abraham. Abraham is a story about a journey of trust that could have helped them navigate the land in between. God asked a man from the Persian Gulf region to leave his native land, which meant to leave everything that felt normal and comfortable and safe, and to go to a new country with an uncertain future. The only thing that Abraham had to travel on was a promise from God that if he were obedient, that eventually God would make his descendants into a great nation. That couldn't happen, of course, until Abraham and Sarah had a child. And God is asking Abraham, will you trust me? Will you trust me? And Abraham says, yes, Lord, I will trust you. I will go where you lead. But even as Abraham is obedient, he still had an in-between land to navigate. God said, move and I'll pour out my blessing on you. But before Moses could even take his first step, there was a demoralizing twist in his story. Famine and drought and scarcity struck the land. And then he and his wife had to endure a very, very long period of infertility. And as they waited for God's promise of a child to materialize, Abraham was sucked into a regional war. He was obedient, but it took a long time in the desert before God made good on his promises. The Israelites knew this story as they traveled through the desert. They had known this story since birth. But the tragedy is that they failed to remember this story and to draw on its lessons for wisdom and strength. They became forgetful. Have you ever become forgetful? They became forgetful. And this forgetfulness undermined their faith in God. If they had only remembered God's faithfulness in the past, it would have better prepared them for a faithful response in the present as they moved into an uncertain future. And things are no different for you and me. We also have the story of Abraham, but unlike the Israelites, we also have the story of the Exodus. We also have the stories of Jesus in the early church. We also have 2,000 years of stories that compose the Christian tradition. Brothers and sisters, we have our own personal stories about how God has led us through difficult times. Have you forgotten your story? Have you forgotten the stories in the Bible? Have you forgotten the stories of the great cloud of witnesses that have gone before us? How many times has God pulled you through a difficult situation? Just think about that for a minute. And then answer the question, is God faithful? It's only been a week since the resurrection. Can somebody come alive and awake this morning and say, amen? Is God faithful? God is faithful, my friends. And if God pulled you through all of those hard times in the past and all of that great cloud of witnesses that have gone before us, why in the world wouldn't God pull you through your present time of trouble? Our corporate and personal memory of God's faithfulness can shore up our faith and help us to navigate the land in between. And so, in conclusion, and if there's anybody planted to get the children, now's the time to quietly go get them and quietly bring them back in. And in conclusion, I just want to ask you, how are you doing in the land in between? Do you understand, my friends, do you really understand that times of difficult transition are limited periods intended to prepare you for a greater blessing? Or are you focused so much on your pain that you have capitulated to a spirit of despair, thinking nothing is ever going to change? We need perspective when we're going through the land in between. Do you understand, my friends, that this time of testing and trial can function to help shape you into the person that God needs you to be in service to the world and to others? Or do you see it as a time of meaningless pain and punishment? Do you really appreciate how God provides for you in the land in between? Or are you taking this for granted, focusing on what you lack, and slipping into chronic complaint? Can you recognize the gifts that God is giving you while you are in the desert? Knowing that God doesn't wait until you've reached the other side to give you blessing, but God blesses you even in the land in between. Are you drawing on the memory of God's faithfulness in the stories of our ancestors and in your own personal life to strengthen your faith? Or are you forgetting all that God has already done for us and for you and falling into an attitude of ingratitude? Will we endure trial and tribulation and come out on the other side with a faith that is fully alive and well? Will we pass through disappointment and still cling to the belief that God is good, that God will lead us to a better day, that God is still on the throne, and that God can be trusted? Will we trust God in times of transition? I want you to remember that it's not simply the hardships that will form you in the land in between. Our responses to those hardships will shape us as well. And with every painful experience we endure, our response will disclose who we are and will set the trajectory of the kind of people that we will be. And my prayer this morning is that all of us will draw on the memory of God's faithfulness in the past so that we can faithfully navigate the land in between. Amen.